When a freezing 8-year-old girl stared at his daughter's plate of fries with hollow eyes, billionaire Mason Hale made a decision that would destroy his reputation, threaten his empire, and expose secrets he'd buried for 15 years. What started as one meal in a forgotten diner became a war against everyone who believed poverty was a character flaw, and the woman everyone called a gold digger would prove them all catastrophically wrong. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The rain hit the diner windows like fists. Mason Hale sat in the corner booth watching his daughter drag a French fry through ketchup, her tongue stuck out in concentration, and felt something close to peace for the first time in 6 days. Maybe 6 months. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that peculiar diner glow that made 9 p.m. feel like 3 a.m. And outside, the storm was turning the parking lot into a small lake. "Daddy, why do they call them French fries if they're American?" Chloe asked, not looking up from her architectural project involving ketchup, a chicken tender, and structural engineering that defied physics. "I have no idea, sweetheart." "That's a terrible answer." "You're absolutely right." She grinned at him, gap-toothed and perfect, and Mason felt his chest tighten the way it always did when she smiled like that. 8 years old, and she already had his number. Already knew when he was distracted, when he was pretending to listen, when the weight of Hale Logistics and its 17,000 employees and its stock price and its quarterly projections was crushing him into something that looked like a father but felt like a machine. The diner was nearly empty. An old man at the counter nursing coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. A trucker in the back booth with a newspaper and a plate of meatloaf. The waitress, her name tag said Deb, leaning against the register with the exhausted patience of someone who'd worked a double shift and still had 4 hours to go. Mason had stopped here on impulse, taking an exit he'd never taken before, because Chloe had been staring out the window of the Mercedes with that particular blankness that meant she was thinking about her mother again, and Mason couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle one more silent minute in that car with grief sitting between them like a third passenger. So, random exit, random diner, random choice that felt like the first thing he'd actually decided in months instead of just executed from the list his assistant prepared every morning. "Can I get a milkshake?" Chloe asked. "You already had chicken tenders and fries." "That's not an answer to my question." Mason laughed despite himself. "Chocolate or vanilla?" "Strawberry." "Of course it is." He raised his hand to signal Deb, and that's when he saw them. 2 figures near the door, barely visible through the rain-streaked glass. A woman and a child, both soaked through, the woman's hand gripping the little girl's shoulder in a way that looked protective and desperate at the same time. They weren't coming in, just standing there in the entrance alcove, water dripping off them onto the rubber mat. The woman's face turned toward the diner interior with an expression Mason recognized instantly, because he'd worn it himself once, a long time ago. Hunger. Shame. The particular mathematics of counting change in your pocket and knowing it won't be enough. The little girl, she couldn't have been more than 5, was staring at Chloe's plate with the kind of focus that made Mason's stomach drop. Not the way kids usually looked at food, with greedy excitement or picky judgment. This was different. This was need. Deb had noticed them too. She straightened up from the register, her expression shifting into something harder. "Hey!" she called out, her voice carrying across the empty diner. "You gonna come in or what? Can't have you blocking the door." The woman flinched, pulled the little girl closer, started to turn away. Mason was moving before he'd thought it through. "Wait," he said, standing up from the booth. His knee caught the table edge, and Chloe's milk sloshed in its glass, but he barely noticed. "Please wait." The woman stopped, turned slowly, her face pale under the fluorescent lights, her dark hair plastered to her skull. Up close, Mason could see she was younger than he'd thought, maybe 30, but with the kind of worn-down look that came from too many bad months strung together. Her clothes were thin, wrong for the weather, and her hands were shaking. The little girl beside her had enormous brown eyes and a pink jacket that was 2 sizes too small. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice barely audible over the rain. We're leaving." "Are you hungry?" Mason asked. Wrong question. He knew it immediately. The woman's face closed up like a door slamming, pride and shame warring in her expression. "We're fine," she said. "Thank you." "Mama?" the little girl whispered, tugging on her mother's hand. My tummy? Lucy, no, the woman's voice cracked. We're going back to the car. The car! Mason caught it, that tiny detail that told him everything. They were sleeping in the car. In this weather, in this cold. Chloe had appeared at his elbow, fries still in hand, staring at the little girl with unguarded curiosity. Hi, she said. I'm Chloe. Are you cold? Lucy nodded, a tiny movement. Do you want some fries? I have a lot. Daddy always orders too much food because he thinks I'm still hungry, even when I say I'm not. Chloe, Mason started, but his daughter was already holding out her plate, and the little girl was looking at her mother with such desperate hope that Mason felt something crack open in his chest. The woman, Emily, he would learn later, Emily Carter, stood frozen in the doorway with water pooling around her feet and her daughter's hunger written across her face and the last threads of her dignity unraveling in real time. Please, Mason said quietly, let me buy your daughter dinner. No strings, no questions, just food. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, but it was a weak gesture, already defeated. I can't, she whispered. I can't pay you back. I'm not asking you to. I don't. Her voice broke. I don't take charity. It's not charity, Chloe announced, with the absolute certainty only an 8-year-old could muster. It's sharing. My teacher says sharing is different from charity because sharing means you're friends. Lucy's stomach growled, loud in the silence. Emily made a sound like something breaking. Her hands came up to cover her face, her shoulders shaking, and Mason felt like the world's biggest asshole for putting her in this position, for stripping away her last defenses in front of strangers and a bored waitress and the humming fluorescent lights. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to. It's okay, Emily said, but her voice was wrecked. It's okay. She looked down at Lucy, and whatever she saw there finished the job. Okay, thank you. Just something small, please. Deb was already moving, grabbing menus, her earlier hardness replaced with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been the simple recognition that tips came from people who bought dinner, not from people who stood in doorways dripping. They ended up in Mason's booth, the 4 of them, an arrangement that felt both completely natural and completely insane. Emily perched on the edge of the seat like she might bolt at any second, Lucy pressed against her mother's side, Chloe chattering away about school and her collection of rocks, and how her daddy owned a company, but she wasn't allowed to tell people that, because it made things weird. Chloe, Mason said. What? It's true. Emily was looking at him now, really looking, and he could see her brain working, trying to reconcile the expensive watch he'd forgotten to take off with the rumpled shirt and the fact that he was sitting in a highway diner at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. What kind of company? She asked carefully. Logistics, Mason said, which was technically true and also completely inadequate to describe Hale Logistics, which moved approximately 15% of all commercial freight in North America and had made Mason a billionaire before he turned 30. Oh, Emily said, and Mason could see her deciding not to push it, filing away the information for later, her attention already shifting back to Lucy, who was holding the laminated menu like it was a treasure map. Can I have chicken nuggets? Lucy asked, her voice small. You can have whatever you want, honey, Emily said, and the way she said it, like she was giving her daughter the world instead of a $6 kids meal, made Mason want to punch something. When Deb came over, Lucy ordered chicken nuggets and fries and chocolate milk, her voice getting stronger with each item, her eyes getting brighter. Emily ordered coffee, just coffee, and when Mason said, "Get yourself something to eat too," she shook her head. "I'm not hungry." It was such an obvious lie that even Chloe looked skeptical. "My daddy says that too when he's working," Chloe announced, "but then he eats my leftovers when he thinks I'm not looking." "Traitor," Mason muttered, and Chloe giggled. Emily's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I'm really not hungry." "Then get something for later," Mason said. "For breakfast, please." She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Mason saw the full weight of whatever the last few months had done to her. The calculations, the compromises, the slow erosion of every assumption she'd ever had about how life was supposed to work. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." The food came, and Lucy ate like she was afraid someone would take it away. Emily watched her daughter with an expression that made Mason want to buy out the entire diner, every meal they had, just to erase that look from her face. Chloe kept up a running commentary about everything and nothing, blessedly oblivious to the undercurrents, and slowly, very slowly, Emily began to relax. "How old are you?" Chloe asked Lucy. 5.5? "I'm 8. That means I'm older, so I can teach you things. Do you like rocks?" Lucy nodded uncertainly. "Good, because I have 17 rocks and I know all their names. Well, I made up most of their names, but that's okay because they're my rocks." Emily laughed, a real laugh this time, surprised out of her. "You named your rocks?" "Obviously," Chloe said. "This one's Bartholomew." She pulled a smooth gray stone from her pocket. "And he's very wise. Daddy says I can't bring him to school anymore because of the incident." "What incident?" Emily asked, and Mason groaned. "There was no incident," he said. "I threw Bartholomew at Tyler Morrison because he said girls couldn't play soccer." "That was an incident," Mason admitted. Emily was grinning now, the exhaustion lifting from her face for a moment, and Mason found himself staring at her, at the way she lit up when she smiled, at the kindness in her eyes when she looked at his daughter. "Did you get in trouble?" Lucy asked, fascinated. "So much trouble," Chloe said solemnly. "But Tyler Morrison stopped saying girls couldn't play soccer, so I think it was worth it." "Chloe Elizabeth Hale." "What?" "I'm just being honest. You always say honesty is important." "I'm regretting that lesson," Mason said. But he was smiling too, and when he looked up, he caught Emily watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Outside, the rain had intensified, coming down in sheets now, the wind rattling the windows. The temperature was dropping. Mason could see his breath when he looked toward the door. And he found himself thinking about that car Emily had mentioned, whatever car they were sleeping in, on a night like this. Lucy finished her nuggets and started on Chloe's leftover fries. Chloe had pushed them across the table without being asked, and Emily finished her coffee and picked at the eggs and toast that had arrived for breakfast tomorrow, but that Mason suspected she was eating now because she was starving. "Where are you headed?" Mason asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Emily's shoulders tensed. "North, maybe. I'm not sure yet." "Family?" "No." She said it flatly, closing off that line of questioning. "Are you from around here?" "Chicago. Originally." She paused. "We lived in Oak Park until recently." The hesitation told him everything. Until the eviction. Until the money ran out. Until whatever safety net she'd had finally tore apart. "I'm sorry," Mason said. "Don't be." Emily straightened up, some of that earlier defiance coming back. "We're managing fine." They were managing terribly. Any idiot could see that. But Mason knew better than to say it out loud. "Mama," Lucy said sleepily, leaning into Emily's side. "I'm tired." "I know, baby. We'll go back to the car soon." The car. In this weather. In this cold. With temperatures dropping toward freezing and a storm that showed no signs of stopping. Mason made a decision. It was possibly the stupidest decision he'd made in 15 years. It violated every rule he'd set for himself about privacy and boundaries and not getting emotionally involved with strangers. It would complicate his life in ways he couldn't begin to predict. His lawyers would have aneurysms. His board of directors would stage an intervention. He did it anyway. "Come stay at my house tonight," he said. The booth went silent. Even Chloe stopped mid-sentence, her mouth falling open. Emily stared at him. "What?" "My house. I have—" "How did you explain a lakefront mansion without sounding insane?" "I have a lot of space, guest rooms. You and Lucy can stay until the storm passes, until you figure out your next move." "You don't even know us." "I know enough." "You know nothing." Emily's voice was rising, panic edging in. "You know we're broke and desperate and you're offering us what exactly? Out of the goodness of your heart? Men don't do that. Men don't offer strange women a place to stay without—" She cut herself off, but the implication hung in the air. Mason felt his face flush. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" "It's—" He struggled for words. How could he explain the look on Lucy's face when she stared at those fries? How could he explain the memory of being 15 years old and homeless and eating out of dumpsters behind restaurants? How could he explain that his wife had been dead for 3 years, and his daughter barely spoke at home anymore, and his house felt like a mausoleum full of furniture? "No child should sleep in a car in this weather," he said finally. "That's it. That's the whole reason." Emily was shaking her head, her hands clenched into fists on the table. I can't just. We don't know you. You could be anyone." "You're right," Mason said. "You're absolutely right to be suspicious. But I'm not trying to, He pulled out his phone, pulled up his company ID. "This is me, Mason Hale, CEO of Hale Logistics. You can look me up right now. You can call anyone you want and tell them where you are. You can leave the second you feel uncomfortable. But please, please, don't let Lucy sleep in a car tonight when there's a warm bed available." Emily looked at the phone screen, at his face, at Lucy drooping against her side. Her jaw was clenched so tight Mason could see the muscles jumping. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care?" And there it was, the question he'd been asking himself for 3 years. Why care about anything when the person you loved most in the world was gone? Why keep going when every morning felt like swimming through concrete? Why notice a hungry child in a diner when ignoring her would be so much easier? "Because someone cared about me once," Mason said quietly, "when I had nothing. And I'm still here because of it." Something shifted in Emily's expression, a crack in the armor, a moment of recognition. "One night," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "Just until the storm passes." "One night," Mason agreed and tried to ignore the voice in his head saying he was a liar because he already knew one night would never be enough. Deb brought the check and Mason paid in cash, leaving a tip that made her eyebrows climb toward her hairline. Emily noticed. She noticed everything, but didn't comment. Outside, the storm had gotten worse. The wind was howling now, driving the rain sideways, and the temperature had dropped enough that the rain was starting to mix with sleet. Mason's Mercedes sat in the parking lot looking absurdly out of place, all sleek lines and German engineering surrounded by pickup trucks and sedans held together with rust and prayer. Emily had frozen in the doorway, staring at the car. "That's yours?" she asked. "Unfortunately," Mason said, which wasn't the response she'd been expecting. "Unfortunately? It's ostentatious. I bought it because my business partner said I needed to project success, and I've regretted it ever since." "Must be hard," Emily said, and there was an edge to her voice now. "Having such nice problems." Mason winced. Fair point. They ran for the car through the freezing rain, Chloe shrieking with laughter, Lucy pressed against Emily's side, all of them soaked in seconds. Mason fumbled with the keys. His hands were shaking from cold or adrenaline or the sheer insanity of what he was doing, and then they were inside, the doors slamming shut, the heater roaring to life. Emily's car sat across the parking lot, an ancient Toyota with a cracked windshield and a passenger door that didn't match the rest of the body. Mason could see blankets piled in the back seat, a cooler, garbage bags that probably held everything they owned. Emily was looking at it too, her expression unreadable. "I need to grab our things," she said. "I'll help you." "No." The word came out sharp. "No, I can do it myself." Pride again, the last defense she had left. "Okay," Mason said. "We'll wait here with the heat on." Emily nodded and slipped back out into the storm. Mason watched her through the rain-streaked windshield, this slight figure bent against the wind, yanking open the Toyota's back door and pulling out bags. She moved quickly, efficiently, like someone who'd done this before, like someone who knew how to pack a life into garbage bags and move on. Lucy had crawled into the back seat next to Chloe and was staring around the Mercedes interior with wide eyes. "Your car is really clean," she whispered. Chloe shrugged. "Daddy has someone who cleans it every week. It's boring. Our old car had crackers in the seats and everything." "That sounds nice." Mason's chest hurt. Emily returned with 2 bags and a backpack, soaked through again, her teeth chattering. She threw the bags in the trunk and climbed into the passenger seat, water dripping everywhere, her hands shaking as she reached for the seatbelt. "Your car," she started. "Will dry," Mason said. "Don't worry about it." The drive to his house took 40 minutes, the GPS guiding them through increasingly wealthy suburbs, the houses getting bigger and more set back from the road. Emily sat rigid in the passenger seat, watching the neighborhoods change, and Mason could practically hear her rethinking every decision that had led to this moment. In the back seat, Lucy had fallen asleep against Chloe's shoulder. Chloe was still talking, something about her rock collection and a science project involving volcanoes, but her voice had gotten quieter, gentler, like she understood Lucy needed the comfort more than the entertainment. "She's good with her," Emily said softly, nodding toward the girls. "Chloe's always wanted a sibling," Mason said before he could stop himself. "Mistake." Emily's face closed up again. "This isn't," she started. "I know," Mason said quickly. I just meant Chloe likes having someone to talk to. That's all." The silence stretched out, tense and awkward, broken only by Chloe's soft monologue and the sound of rain on the windshield. They turned onto Mason's street. If you could call it a street when there were only 4 houses on it, each one separated by acres of landscaped grounds, and Emily made a small sound in the back of her throat. "You've got to be kidding me," she said. It's not as big as it looks," Mason lied. It was exactly as big as it looked, maybe bigger. The house, mansion, estate, whatever you wanted to call it, sat on a bluff overlooking the lake, all stone and glass and carefully designed casual elegance that had cost more than most people made in a lifetime. The driveway curved through landscaped gardens that were currently being pummeled by freezing rain, and lights blazed from nearly every window, making the place look like some kind of fortress against the dark. Mason had hated it from the moment he bought it. Had bought it anyway because his business partner said he needed a statement property, and because his wife had loved the lake view, and because he'd still been stupid enough to think money could fix grief. He pulled into the circular driveway and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and total. "Holy shit," Emily whispered. "Language," Mason said automatically, then caught himself. "Sorry, I sound like an asshole. You can say whatever you want." Emily was staring at the house like it might bite her. "You live here? Just you and Chloe?" "There's a housekeeper who comes during the day, and a groundskeeper, but yeah, mostly just us." "This is insane." "It's lonely," Mason said, and immediately regretted it because what right did he have to complain about loneliness when this woman had been sleeping in a car? But Emily didn't look angry. She looked sad. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I bet it is." They woke the girls and ran for the front door through the freezing rain, Mason fumbling with his keys again. When had his hand started shaking like this? And then they were inside, standing in the enormous marble foyer with its ridiculous chandelier and its designer furniture and its complete lack of anything resembling warmth. Lucy pressed closer to Emily, her eyes huge. "It's like a castle," Chloe announced proudly. "Except boring because Daddy won't let me paint the walls." "The walls are fine the way they are," Mason said. "They're beige." "That's not fine. That's sad." Emily laughed, a surprise sound, and some of the tension drained from the room. Mason showed them upstairs to one of the guest suites. Bedroom, bathroom, sitting area, all decorated in shades of cream and taupe that his wife had chosen and that he'd never had the heart to change. Emily stood in the doorway like she was afraid to step inside, her wet clothes dripping onto the hardwood. "The bathroom has towels," Mason said, "and there should be robes in the closet. They'll be too big, but they're warm. I can find some clothes tomorrow, for both of you." "We have clothes," Emily said. "I know, I just meant—" He was screwing this up. "Never mind, the important thing is you're warm and dry. If you need anything, my room is at the end of the hall. Chloe's is next to mine." Emily nodded, still not looking at him. Lucy was already exploring, running her hands over the silk duvet cover, peering into the bathroom with its marble counters and rain shower. "Mama, there's a bathtub big enough for swimming," she called out. "Don't touch anything," Emily called back, and Mason could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been operating on adrenaline and fear for too long. "Let her explore," he said gently. "She can't break anything important." "You don't know that." "Then I'll buy new stuff. It's fine." Emily finally looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something in her expression shift. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of something like it. "Thank you," she said. "For dinner, for this, for—" her voice caught. "For seeing us." Mason didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to explain that seeing them had cracked something open in him that he'd thought was permanently sealed. "Get some sleep," he said instead. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." He left her there in the doorway, this soaked and exhausted stranger in his guest room, and went to put Chloe to bed. His daughter was practically vibrating with excitement. "Daddy, can Lucy stay forever?" she asked while he helped her into her pajamas. "Just for tonight, sweetheart." "But why? We have so many empty rooms, and she's nice, and her mama is nice, and I like having them here." "I know you do, but is it because they're poor?" Mason froze. "What?" "Lucy's mama doesn't have money. I could tell. Is that why they can't stay?" How did you explain class and circumstance and the unbridgeable gap between their world and Emily's to an 8-year-old? How did you explain that sometimes kindness wasn't enough? "It's complicated," Mason said. "That's what you always say when you don't want to explain things. You're too smart for your own good. You always say that too." Chloe climbed into bed and looked up at him with her mother's eyes, serious and searching. "I miss Mama." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I know, baby. I miss her too. Is that why you're sad all the time?" "I'm not," but he couldn't finish the lie. "Yeah, that's why." Chloe reached out and patted his hand, a gesture so adult and so heartbreaking that Mason had to look away. "Maybe Lucy and her mama can make you less sad," she said, "like they made tonight less sad." Mason kissed her forehead, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Downstairs, the house settled into its usual nighttime silence. Mason poured himself a whiskey he didn't want and stood at the windows overlooking the lake, watching the storm rage across the water. The house creaked around him, all its empty rooms and expensive furniture and carefully maintained loneliness. Somewhere upstairs, Emily and Lucy were probably asleep by now. Warm, safe, fed. It should have felt like enough. Like a good deed done, a box checked, a random act of kindness that he could feel good about tomorrow. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, looking down into depths he couldn't measure. Mason drained his whiskey and went to bed, and tried not to think about the fact that for the first time in 3 years, his house didn't feel completely empty. Outside, the storm raged on into the night, and in the morning, everything would change. Mason woke to the smell of coffee, which was wrong because the housekeeper didn't come on Wednesdays and he hadn't programmed the automatic timer in months. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, momentarily disoriented, before the previous night came flooding back. Emily, Lucy, the diner. The storm that was still battering the windows with enough force to rattle the glass. Coffee meant Emily was awake. In his kitchen, making herself at home in a space that hadn't felt like home in years. He should have felt violated, territorial, something. Instead, he felt relieved. Mason dragged himself out of bed and pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, catching sight of himself in the mirror and wincing. He looked like hell. 3 days of stubble, hair sticking up in 6 directions, dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to fix anymore. The face of a man who'd stopped caring what he looked like somewhere around the same time he'd stopped caring about most things. Downstairs, the kitchen was brighter than he'd seen it in months. Someone had opened the curtains, letting in the gray storm light, and Emily stood at the counter wearing one of the guest robes that swallowed her whole, her damp hair pulled back in a messy knot, pouring coffee into 2 mugs like she'd done it 1,000 times before. She looked up when he entered, and something flashed across her face. Embarrassment, maybe, or defiance. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I couldn't sleep, and I heard you moving around, and I thought, I shouldn't have just assumed I could use your kitchen. I'll clean everything up." "It's fine," Mason said, and meant it. "Is that for me?" She glanced at the second mug. "I wasn't sure how you take it." "Black is good." Emily handed him the mug, careful not to let their fingers touch, and Mason caught a whiff of soap and shampoo. She must have showered, used the guest bathroom's fancy products that had sat unopened for years. The robe sleeves kept sliding down over her hands, and she kept pushing them back up in a gesture that was somehow both irritating and endearing. "Lucy's still asleep," Emily said, like she needed to explain her presence. "She never sleeps past 6, but I think yesterday just wore her out." "Chloe, too. Usually she's up at dawn demanding pancakes." They stood in awkward silence, sipping coffee, the storm providing white noise that filled the gaps in conversation. Emily kept glancing around the kitchen, at the commercial-grade appliances that never got used, the marble countertops that cost more than some cars, the breakfast nook with its view of the lake that was currently obscured by sheets of rain. "This is insane," she said finally. "The house? All of it. This kitchen is bigger than the apartment Lucy and I had in Oak Park, and that's just the kitchen. Mason didn't know what to say to that. Apologizing felt wrong. Defending it felt worse. I didn't grow up like this, he said instead. If that helps. Emily's eyes sharpened. No? No, I grew up in South Chicago. My dad was a mechanic. My mom cleaned houses. He paused, old memories surfacing. They died when I was 15. Car accident on the Dan Ryan. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Mason took another sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him. I ended up in foster care for about 6 months. Hated it. Ran away. Spent the next 2 years sleeping in shelters and under bridges and anywhere else I could find. Emily had gone very still, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. How did you... She started, then stopped. Sorry, that's none of my business. I got lucky, Mason said, which was the short version. The long version involved a youth center director who'd refused to give up on him, a GED program, a scholarship to community college, a logistics internship that turned into a job that turned into a company when he'd figured out how to run routes 20% more efficiently than anyone else in the industry. And I worked like hell, but mostly I got lucky. That's not luck, Emily said quietly. That's surviving. Their eyes met across the kitchen island, and Mason felt something pass between them. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that came from knowing what the bottom looked like. The moment broke when Chloe's voice echoed down the stairs. Daddy, Lucy's awake and she wants to see the lake, but it's all rainy and gross. Mason smiled despite himself. And good morning to you too, sweetheart. Chloe appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing mismatched pajamas and dragging a confused-looking Lucy by the hand. Lucy was wearing one of Chloe's nightgowns that pooled around her feet like a ball gown, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes still heavy with sleep. Can we make pancakes? Chloe demanded. Please, Mason corrected automatically. Can we please make pancakes, and also can Lucy stay forever because she's my new best friend and I already told her about Bartholomew? Lucy nodded solemnly. He's very wise. Emily's mouth twitched. We're not staying forever, honey, just until the storm passes. But why? Chloe's voice hit that particular pitch that meant an argument was brewing. We have 1,000,000 empty rooms and you guys don't have anywhere to go, and Daddy's always sad and lonely anyway, so you'd be doing us a favor, really. Chloe, Mason said, his face heating, that's enough. It's true, though. Emily was looking at him now, something soft in her expression that made his chest tight. Pancakes sound good, she said, clearly trying to redirect. Can I help? 20 minutes later, the kitchen was chaos. Chloe had insisted on helping, which meant there was flour on every surface and batter in her hair. Lucy sat at the breakfast bar watching with wide eyes, while Emily moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency, finding mixing bowls and spatulas without having to ask where anything was, like she had some kind of innate sense for how kitchens worked. Mason stood at the stove flipping pancakes and trying not to notice how natural this felt. How right. 4 people in a kitchen that usually echoed with emptiness, the girls giggling over some private joke, Emily's shoulder occasionally brushing his as she reached for the syrup. Your housekeeper is going to murder us, Emily said, surveying the flour-coated counters. Mrs. Chen has seen worse, Mason lied. Mrs. Chen had definitely not seen worse. Mrs. Chen maintained this kitchen like a surgical theater. Somehow, I doubt that. They ate at the breakfast nook, plates piled high with pancakes that were slightly burned because Mason had been distracted by the way Emily laughed at Chloe's stories. The storm continued to rage outside, the lake barely visible through the gray curtain of rain, and Mason found himself hoping it would last another day, another week. However long it took for the knot in his chest to loosen. So what do you do? Chloe asked Emily through a mouthful of pancakes. For work? Emily's smile faltered. I was a graphic designer for a marketing firm downtown. Was? Mason caught it immediately. They downsized 6 months ago. I've been looking since then, but... She shrugged, the gesture trying for casual and missing. The market's tough right now. That's bullshit, Mason said, then caught himself. Sorry, 6 months is a long time to be looking. You must be good at what you do. I was. Emily pushed a pancake around her plate. Doesn't matter much when you're competing with 22-year-olds who'll work for half the salary. Lucy had gone quiet, picking at her food, and Emily reached over to squeeze her hand. "It's okay, baby. Mama's going to figure it out." "How?" Lucy asked, her voice small. Emily's face did something complicated. "I always do, don't I?" But Mason could see the cracks in her certainty, the exhaustion behind the brave face. He'd seen the same expression in the mirror often enough to recognize it. His phone buzzed. It had been buzzing all morning, messages piling up from his assistant and his COO, and half the board of directors wondering where the hell he was and why he'd missed the morning conference call. Mason ignored it, silencing the phone and setting it face down on the table. "Do you need to get that?" Emily asked. "No. It might be important." "It's always important. That doesn't mean it matters." Emily studied him for a long moment. "Is that what being rich is like? Everything's important, but nothing matters?" The observation was so accurate it hurt. "Something like that," Mason said. After breakfast, Chloe dragged Lucy upstairs to show her the rock collection, leaving Mason and Emily alone with the wreckage of the kitchen. They cleaned in silence, falling into an easy rhythm. Emily washing, Mason drying, the dishwasher humming between them. "You don't have to do this," Mason said as Emily scrubbed a mixing bowl. "The housekeeper, I know. But I can't just sit around doing nothing. It makes me feel—" She trailed off, searching for the word. "Useless?" Yeah, Mason understood that too. The particular torture of having nothing to do while the world moved around you. They finished cleaning and moved to the living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the lake. The storm had intensified, waves crashing against the bluff, with enough force that Mason could feel the vibrations through the floor. Emily stood at the window, the oversized robe making her look even smaller, watching the water with an expression Mason couldn't read. "I need to look for work," she said abruptly. "Today. Even in this weather. There's a temp agency in Evanston that sometimes has same-day placements." "In this storm. I can't afford to wait for good weather." "Emily, don't." She turned to face him, her jaw set. "Don't tell me it's okay to take a day off. Don't tell me you'll help. Don't—" Her voice cracked. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Mason held up his hands in surrender. "I was just going to say you should at least wait until the storm passes. You can't drive in this. It's not safe." "I've driven in worse." "In that car?" It came out harsher than he'd intended, and Emily's face flushed with anger. "That car has gotten us this far," she said tightly. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You meant it's a piece of shit. You meant I should have something better. You meant—" She stopped, taking a shaky breath. "I know what you meant." They stood on opposite sides of the living room, the space between them suddenly vast. Upstairs, the girls' laughter filtered down, oblivious to the tension below. "I'm sorry," Mason said quietly. "You're right. That was a shitty thing to say." Emily's shoulders sagged. "No, I'm sorry. I'm not used to accepting help. It makes me feel like I'm failing Lucy." "You're not failing her. You're keeping her alive." "Barely. That counts." Emily laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Does it? Because some days it doesn't feel like enough. Some days it feels like I'm just postponing the inevitable." Mason moved closer, slowly, like approaching a skittish animal. "What's the inevitable?" "Losing her." Emily's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Child services. Foster care. Some nice family with money and stability taking her because I'm not. That's not going to happen. You don't know that." "I won't let it happen." The words were out before Mason could stop them, a promise he had no right to make, and Emily looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You can't just— You barely know us. You can't make promises like that." "Watch me." "Mason, stay," he said. "Not just until the storm passes. Stay until you get back on your feet. A week, a month. However long it takes." Emily was shaking her head before he finished. "That's insane. We can't just move in with you." "Why not? I have the space. You need the help. It's logical." "Nothing about this is logical." "Then call it illogical. I don't care." Mason ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. "Look, I know this is weird. I know you have every reason to say no, but I'm asking anyway, please. Let me help you." "Why?" Emily's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why do you care so much about what happens to us?" Because watching Lucy stare at those fries had cracked something open in him. Because Emily's stubborn pride reminded him of his own 15-year-old self, too scared to ask for help and too proud to accept it. Because his daughter had smiled more in the past 12 hours than she had in the past 12 months. Because his house felt like a home again with them in it. Because I can, Mason said instead. And because someone should. The silence stretched out, broken only by the storm and the distant sound of children playing. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, the robe sleeves falling over her hands again. 1 month, she said finally. And I pay rent. You don't have to. 1 month, and I pay rent, or we leave right now. Those are the terms. Mason recognized an ultimatum when he heard one. Okay, what's reasonable? $500 a month. That's way below market rate. It's what I can afford. Take it or leave it. Fine, $500. Plus you help with Chloe sometimes. Homework, dinner, that sort of thing. Mrs. Chen leaves at 3 and I'm usually stuck at the office until 7. Emily's eyes narrowed. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a trade. Rent for childcare, completely above board. You're manipulating me. I'm negotiating with you. There's a difference. Despite everything, Emily's mouth twitched. You're kind of an asshole, you know that? I've been told. She studied him for a long moment, and Mason forced himself to stay still under the scrutiny, to not fidget or make promises he couldn't keep or do any of the things that usually got him through difficult conversations. 1 month, Emily said again, and if at any point this gets weird, you can leave. No questions asked. Okay. She took a shaky breath. Okay, we'll stay. The relief that flooded through Mason was disproportionate to the situation. Inappropriate, probably. He didn't care. I'll have Mrs. Chen set up the guest suite properly, he said, already mentally rearranging his schedule. And we can move your stuff from the car. I can handle my own stuff. Right, of course. Another awkward silence, both of them standing in the middle of his absurdly large living room, not quite sure what happened next. Chloe's shriek of laughter broke the moment, followed by Lucy's quieter giggle and the thunder of small feet on expensive hardwood. They're going to destroy your house, Emily said. Good. It could use some destroying. The girls appeared at the top of the stairs, Chloe waving something over her head. Daddy, can we play dress-up in Mama's old closet? Mason's chest tightened. His wife's clothes were still in the master bedroom closet, untouched since her death, preserved like a museum exhibit he couldn't bring himself to dismantle. Chloe, I don't think, he started. Please? Lucy's never had fancy dresses, and there's like 1,000,000 of them just sitting there, and Mama would want someone to use them, right? The logic was unassailable and completely devastating. Emily was watching him carefully. You don't have to, she said quietly. If it's too much. But maybe it wasn't too much. Maybe it was exactly the right amount. Maybe his wife would have liked the idea of another little girl finding joy in silk and sequins instead of letting them rot in the dark. Okay, Mason said, his voice rough. But you have to be careful. Some of those dresses are delicate. Chloe whooped and dragged Lucy back upstairs, already planning elaborate fashion shows. Are you sure? Emily asked. No, but I'm doing it anyway. They spent the rest of the morning in a strange domestic rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Emily made phone calls about jobs while Mason tried to work from the study, both of them pretending they weren't listening to the girls' elaborate games upstairs. Around noon, Mason ordered Chinese food. Too much Chinese food, enough to feed 8 people instead of 4, and they ate in the kitchen while rain continued to hammer the windows. Lucy fell asleep on the couch after lunch, exhausted from the morning's excitement, and Chloe retreated to her room with strict instructions to work on the homework she'd been avoiding. That left Mason and Emily alone again, the house settling into quiet around them. I need to go get some things from the car, Emily said. Clothes for Lucy. Some of her toys. I'll come with you. You don't have to... Emily. Mason cut her off gently. Let me help, please. They bundled up in rain gear, Mason's expensive technical jacket on Emily, looking ridiculous and somehow perfect, and made a run for the Toyota. The parking lot of his own house felt surreal, this piece of shit car sitting between his Mercedes and the garage that housed a vintage Porsche he never drove. Emily's hands shook as she unlocked the trunk. Inside was everything. Literally everything. Clothes in garbage bags, a box of kitchen supplies, toys, books, photo albums, a life packed into a space meant for groceries and spare tires. Jesus. Mason breathed. Emily's jaw tightened. Don't! I wasn't. Yes, you were. You were thinking about how pathetic this is, how someone's entire life shouldn't fit in a trunk. I was thinking about how strong you are, Mason said, and meant it. Keeping it all together like this, making sure Lucy has her toys, her books, the things that matter. Emily's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I couldn't. She's already lost so much. I couldn't let her lose everything. They carried the bags inside through the freezing rain, making 3 trips, both of them soaked by the end. Emily's teeth were chattering as they piled everything in the guest room, water dripping onto the expensive carpet that Mason suddenly couldn't care less about. You should shower, he said. Warm up. I can help Lucy when she wakes up. I don't need... Emily stopped herself. Thank you. I'd like that. She disappeared into the bathroom, and Mason heard the water start, heard her moving around, heard the small broken sound she made when she thought no one could hear her crying. He stood in the hallway, hands clenched into fists, wanting to break something, wanting to find whoever had decided Emily and Lucy deserved to sleep in cars and make them understand what that actually meant, wanting to fix everything with money and influence and all the weapons wealth provided, but knowing deep down that some things couldn't be fixed, only survived. The shower shut off. Mason went downstairs before Emily emerged, giving her privacy she probably needed, and found Lucy awake on the couch, staring at the lake with wide eyes. It's really big, she said. Yeah, it is. Do you own it? Mason smiled. Nobody owns Lake Michigan, but I get to look at it every day. That's lucky. Yeah, Mason said, looking at this tiny girl in his daughter's borrowed nightgown, thinking about her sleeping in that car, thinking about all the luck in the world and how randomly it got distributed. I guess it is. Lucy was quiet for a moment, then, Is my mama okay? The question hit him in the chest. She's okay, Mason said, hoping it was true. She's just tired. She's always tired. I know. Is it my fault? Mason knelt down so he was eye level with her. No. None of this is your fault. You understand me? None of it. Lucy's lower lip trembled. But if I wasn't here, Mama would have enough money. Don't. Mason's voice came out sharper than he'd intended. Don't ever think that. Your mama loves you more than anything in the world. You're the reason she keeps fighting. But we lost our house. That's not your fault either. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. It's not fair and it's not right, but it's not because of anything you did. Lucy considered this with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could muster. Okay, she said finally. Can I have a snack? Just like that, crisis averted, moved on to more important matters. Mason had to smile. Let's see what we can find. They raided the pantry, which was embarrassingly well stocked considering Mason barely ate at home, and Lucy chose animal crackers with the careful deliberation of someone making a major life decision. They were sitting at the kitchen island when Emily appeared, showered and dressed in clean clothes from the garbage bags, her hair wet and starting to curl. She looked younger like this, less worn down, almost happy. Animal crackers for lunch, she said, raising an eyebrow. It's a snack, Lucy corrected seriously. Mr. Mason said so. Mr. Mason, huh? Mason shrugged. I didn't know what else she should call me. How about Mason? Works for me. Emily stole an animal cracker from Lucy's pile, earning an indignant squeak, and the normalcy of it, the casual theft, the mock outrage, the easy laughter, made Mason's chest ache. This was what he'd been missing. Not just companionship, but this. The small domestic moments that added up to something bigger than their parts. I got a call back, Emily said abruptly. From the temp agency. They have something for next week. Data entry. It's not much, but that's great, Mason said, meaning it. It's 45 minutes away. I'll need to leave early, and I don't have anyone to watch Lucy. I'll do it, Mason said immediately. Emily blinked. You? Or Mrs. Chen? Chloe loves having Lucy around. It's not a problem. Mason, you can't just... Yes, I can. We already agreed. Rent for childcare, remember? That was for Chloe, not... Does it matter? Mason heard the edge in his own voice, the frustration bleeding through. You need help. I can help. Why is that so hard to accept? Emily's eyes flashed. Because people don't just help. Not without wanting something. Maybe I do want something. What? Mason gestured around the empty kitchen, the silent house, the life he'd built that felt like a prison. This, what we had this morning, pancakes and chaos, and my daughter actually smiling. Is that so terrible? The anger drained from Emily's face, replaced by something softer and infinitely more dangerous. No, she said quietly. It's not terrible. They stood there in the kitchen, Lucy obliviously eating her crackers between them, and Mason felt the ground shift beneath his feet, felt the careful distance he'd been maintaining start to crack. This was a mistake. He knew it was a mistake. Getting attached to them, letting them into his life, pretending this could be anything more than temporary, all of it was a mistake. He was going to make it anyway. 1 month, Emily said, like she was reminding herself. Just 1 month. Right, Mason agreed. 1 month. They both knew it was a lie. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping, and inside, something new was beginning, fragile and terrifying and completely inevitable. The 1-month agreement lasted exactly 9 days before everything went sideways. Mason should have seen it coming, should have recognized the signs when his COO Richard started asking pointed questions about why he was leaving the office at 5:30 instead of 8. Should have paid attention when his assistant mentioned, casually, too casually, that some of the board members were curious about his sudden change in routine. Should have, could have, didn't. He was too busy noticing the way Emily had started leaving notes on the kitchen counter. Reminders about Chloe's soccer practice. Shopping lists written in neat handwriting that looked nothing like the expensive scrawl of his previous life. Too busy coming home to the smell of actual cooking instead of takeout containers and Mrs. Chen's well-meaning but bland casseroles. Too busy watching Lucy and Chloe become actual sisters in everything but name, their laughter filling rooms that had been silent for 3 years. The house had started to feel like something other than a mausoleum, and Mason had been stupid enough to think that wouldn't have consequences. The first consequence arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of Richard Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen, unfortunately, standing in Mason's office with a tablet and an expression that suggested someone had died. "We need to talk," Richard said, closing the door behind him. Mason looked up from the logistics report he'd been pretending to read. "Good morning to you, too." "Don't." Richard set the tablet on Mason's desk, screen side up. "Just don't." The screen showed a photo. Mason and Emily at the grocery store 3 days ago, Emily laughing at something Chloe had said, Mason's hand on the shopping cart, Lucy riding in the front seat. Someone had taken it through the window. Someone had been watching. "What the hell is this?" Mason demanded. "That's what I'd like to know." Richard's voice was tight. "That's what the board would like to know. That's what our investors are going to want to know when this hits the tabloids, which, according to my sources, should be sometime tomorrow." Mason's stomach dropped. "How? Does it matter? You've been seen, multiple times. You and some woman and her kid playing house at your mansion. People notice these things, Mason. People talk." It's not like that." "Then what is it like? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've moved your mistress into your house 9 months after your wife died." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. "My wife died 3 years ago, and Emily is not my mistress. 3 years, 9 months, the optics are the same." Richard started pacing, the way he always did when he was working through a problem. "You're a public figure whether you like it or not. Hale Logistics is a publicly traded company. Our stock price is built on investor confidence, and investor confidence is built on you being stable, responsible, not shacking up with random women you picked up at. Where did you even meet her?" "A diner," Mason said flatly. "I met her at a diner. She and her daughter were homeless. I offered them a place to stay." Richard stopped pacing. "You what?" "You heard me." "Jesus Christ, Mason." Richard dragged his hands over his face. "Do you have any idea how this looks? Any idea at all?" "I don't care how it looks." "Well, you should care, because the board sure as hell cares. Because our stockholders care. Because every competitor we have is going to use this to paint you as unstable. And unstable CEOs cost money." Mason stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "So what do you want me to do? Throw them out? Put a woman and a 5-year-old back on the street because it might affect our stock price?" "I want you to think," Richard said, his voice rising. "I want you to think about what you're risking here. Not just for yourself, but for the 17,000 people who depend on this company for their livelihoods. The pension funds that depend on our dividends. I know what's at stake. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're acting like a man who's forgotten everything he built. The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting. Get out, Mason said quietly. Mason. Get out. Richard grabbed his tablet and left, and Mason stood alone in his office overlooking Lake Michigan, watching container ships move across the water and feeling the careful structure of his life begin to crack. He left work early, 5 o'clock instead of his usual 7, and drove home with Richard's words echoing in his head. The house appeared through the trees, lights blazing in windows that used to stay dark, and Mason felt his chest tighten with something that might have been fear, or might have been anger, or might have been both. Inside, chaos. Chloe and Lucy had apparently decided to build a fort in the living room, using every blanket in the house, plus most of the couch cushions. Emily was in the kitchen, flour in her hair, attempting to make cookies while fielding questions from both girls about whether cookies were better with chocolate chips or M and Ms. Both, Chloe was insisting. Obviously both. There's no such thing as obviously both, Emily said, but she was smiling. That's just greed. Daddy says greed is what makes capitalism work, Chloe announced, and Mason winced from the doorway. Daddy is oversimplifying complex economic theory, he said. Emily jumped, spinning around with a spatula in hand. You're home early. Yeah. Mason set his briefcase down, suddenly exhausted. Needed to get out of the office. Something in his voice must have registered because Emily's smile faded. Girls, why don't you go test the structural integrity of your fort? Make sure it can withstand siege conditions. What's siege conditions? Lucy asked. It means go play and don't come back for 20 minutes, Chloe translated, already dragging Lucy toward the living room. Adults need to do boring adult talking. When they were gone, Emily turned to face him fully. What happened? Mason considered lying. Considered saying everything was fine, nothing to worry about, just a long day at the office. But Emily had gotten good at reading him over the past 9 days, had developed an annoying ability to see through his bullshit. Someone took pictures, he said, of us. At the grocery store. Emily went very still. Pictures. They're going to the tabloids. Tomorrow, probably. Mason loosened his tie, suddenly feeling strangled. My COO seems to think this is going to tank our stock price. Because of me. Because of perception. Because investors are idiots who care more about optics than... He stopped, took a breath. It's not your fault. Emily was already untying her apron, her movement sharp and controlled. I need to leave. What? No. Mason, if my being here is going to hurt your company, I don't care about the company. Yes, you do. You care about the 17,000 people who work for you. You care about doing right by them. Emily's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I won't be the reason you lose that. You're not going anywhere. You can't just decide that. Watch me. Mason moved closer, blocking her path to the door even though she wasn't moving toward it. This is my house, my decision, and I'm deciding you stay. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Emily said, and her voice cracked. This is why I didn't want to accept your help in the first place. Because people like you don't get to just help people like me without consequences. People like me? Rich people. People with reputations to protect. People who... She gestured around the kitchen at the expensive appliances and the marble countertops and the life she'd never fit into. People who live in houses like this don't take in homeless women without everyone assuming the worst. Let them assume. Easy for you to say, you're not the one they're going to call a gold digger. You're not the one they're going to say manipulated a grieving widower for. Stop. Mason grabbed her shoulders, gentle but firm. Stop. I don't care what they say about me. And I don't care what they say about you because I know it's not true. Your board cares. Screw the board. Emily laughed, but it was a broken sound. You don't mean that. I absolutely mean that. I built this company from nothing. I own 60% of the voting shares. The board works for me, not the other way around. That's not how it actually works, and you know it. Emily pulled away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. You have responsibilities, investors, employees. You can't just ignore all that because why? Because you feel sorry for me. The accusation hit harder than it should have. Is that what you think this is? Mason asked quietly. Pity? What else would it be? Maybe I like having you here. Maybe Chloe is happier than she's been in 3 years. Maybe coming home doesn't feel like walking into a tomb anymore. Emily's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That's not enough. That's not a good enough reason to risk everything you've built. It's enough for me. They stood in the kitchen with the smell of cookies burning in the oven and the sound of children laughing in the next room, and Mason watched Emily make the calculations. Watched her weigh her pride against Lucy's safety, her dignity against the reality of sleeping in cars. I can't do this, she said finally. I can't be the reason you lose everything. You're not... Mason, listen to me. Emily's voice was steady now, resigned. I've been poor my whole life. I know how this works. People like you don't stay interested in people like me. Eventually, the novelty wears off, or the cost gets too high, or you meet someone more appropriate, and then where does that leave me? Leave Lucy? That's not going to happen. You don't know that. I know I've spent 3 years feeling nothing. I know the first time I felt anything was watching your daughter stare at a plate of French fries. I know... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. I know I don't want you to leave. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and Mason could see her trying to decide whether to believe him, whether to take another risk when the last ones had all failed. The smoke alarm went off before she could answer, shrill and piercing, and they both lunged for the oven. The cookies were black, completely incinerated, smoke pouring out when Emily opened the door. Shit, she muttered, grabbing a towel to fan the alarm. Language, Mason said automatically, then caught himself. Sorry, you can say whatever you want. I can't believe I burned them. I've made these cookies 100 times and Emily stopped, looking at the charred remains and started laughing. Not happy laughter, the kind that came from too much stress with nowhere to go. Mason found himself laughing too, the absurdity of it overwhelming everything else. Here they were, arguing about tabloids and stock prices, and the fundamental inequality of their circumstances while cookies burned and children played in blanket forts. The smoke cleared, the alarm stopped. Emily set the ruined cookie sheet on the counter and leaned against it, her shoulders shaking. I'm so tired, she said quietly. I'm so tired of being scared all the time. Mason didn't have an answer for that, didn't have anything except the desire to make it better, and the growing realization that he had no idea how. Stay, he said instead. Please. At least until we see what the tabloids actually print, until we know what we're dealing with. And if it's bad, then we'll handle it. We, Emily repeated like she was testing the word. We, Mason confirmed. She studied him with those dark eyes that saw too much, and Mason forced himself not to look away, forced himself to let her see whatever she needed to see to believe him. 1 week, she said finally. I'll stay 1 more week. But if this gets worse, if your company suffers because of us, we're gone. No arguments. It wasn't what Mason wanted, but it was better than nothing. Okay, he said. 1 week. They ordered pizza for dinner. The cookies were unsalvageable, and ate in the blanket fort because Chloe insisted and Lucy backed her up, and Emily was too tired to argue. Mason found himself wedged between couch cushions, his expensive suit getting covered in pizza grease, listening to his daughter explain the complex political structure of the Fort Kingdom, while Lucy nodded seriously. And this is the throne room, Chloe said, pointing to a particularly unstable section. Only the queen gets to sit here. Who's the queen? Mason asked. Lucy, obviously. I'm the general. You're the treasurer because you're good with money. And Emily's the... Chloe paused, thinking. What do you want to be? Emily smiled, but there was sadness in it. I don't know. What's left? You could be the wizard, Lucy suggested. Wizards are powerful. Then I'm the wizard. They played kingdom until Lucy fell asleep against Emily's shoulder, and Chloe started yawning. Mason carried Lucy upstairs while Emily herded a protesting Chloe toward her room. And for a few minutes, everything felt almost normal. Almost like they were a real family, instead of whatever complicated arrangement this actually was. He was tucking Lucy into the guest room bed when she stirred, her eyes half opening. Mason, she murmured. Yeah, sweetheart? Are we going to have to leave? The question punched the air from his lungs. No, he said, hoping it was true. You're safe here. Promise? Mason looked at this tiny girl who'd already lost too much, who trusted him with a faith he didn't deserve, and made a promise he had no right to make. I promise. Lucy smiled and burrowed deeper into the blankets, already asleep again. Mason stood there for a moment, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of his promise settle onto his shoulders. Emily was in the hallway when he emerged, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You shouldn't make promises you can't keep, she said quietly. Who says I can't keep it? Mason, I mean it. Whatever happens with the tabloids, whatever the board says, you and Lucy stay. I'll make it work. How? I don't know yet, but I will. Emily shook her head, but there was something soft in her expression. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. She smiled despite herself, and they stood in the hallway of his absurdly large house, close enough that Mason could smell the cookies and flower scent of her hair, far enough that the distance felt deliberate. Thank you, Emily said. For dinner. For everything? You don't have to thank me. Yeah, I do. She turned to go back to the guest room, but Mason caught her hand, just for a second, just long enough to feel her pulse jump under his fingers. Emily, don't, she said, but she didn't pull away. Please don't make this more complicated than it already is. What if I want it to be complicated? Then you're an idiot. Wouldn't be the first time. Emily pulled her hand free, but gently. Good night, Mason. Good night. He watched her disappear into the guest room, watched the door close between them, and stood alone in the hallway feeling like he'd just lost something he never actually had. The tabloid hit the next morning. Mason's assistant forwarded it to him at 6 a.m. with a brief message. Damage control meeting at 8. Richard is losing his mind. The headline read, Billionaire's Mystery Woman. Hale Logistics CEO, playing house with homeless single mother. The article was worse. Speculation about Emily's motives, thinly veiled suggestions about what services she might be providing in exchange for room and board, quotes from anonymous sources suggesting Mason's judgment had been compromised by grief and loneliness. They dug up Emily's employment history, her eviction, her maxed-out credit cards. They'd made her sound like a con artist instead of someone who'd been screwed over by circumstances and bad luck. Mason read it twice, his hands shaking with rage, then forwarded it to his lawyer with instructions to explore every possible lawsuit. Then he went downstairs to find Emily already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in her hands and tears streaming down her face. Hey, he said softly. Hey, it's okay. It's not okay. Emily's voice was raw. They called me a prostitute, Mason. They didn't use the word, but that's what they meant. They said that I'm using Lucy to manipulate you, and it's garbage. It's tabloid garbage, and none of it's true. It doesn't matter if it's true. People will believe it. Emily stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her coffee. I need to pack. We need to leave before this gets worse. No. Mason, they're going to destroy you. Let them try. Mason moved around the table, putting himself between Emily and the stairs. I'm not letting you leave because some hack journalist wrote lies about you. It's not just the article. Your board can go to hell. Your employees will be fine. The company will be fine. We'll take a minor stock hit, and then everyone will forget about this because there'll be some other scandal to chase. Emily was shaking her head, her hands clenched into fists. You don't understand. This is my life. This is what happens to people like me. We get blamed. We get called names. Her voice broke. We get thrown away. Mason grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. I'm not throwing you away. I'm not going to let them do this to you. You can't stop them. Watch me. The 8 o'clock meeting was a disaster. The entire board was there. 12 men and women in expensive suits sitting around a conference table looking at Mason like he'd lost his mind. Richard led the charge, pulling up slides showing their stock price, their institutional investors, the PR nightmare currently unfolding across social media. We need a statement, Richard said. Something clear and unambiguous. Emily Carter is not your girlfriend. You are performing an act of charity. She'll be moving out immediately. No, Mason said. The room went silent. No? Richard's voice climbed an octave. Mason, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. Emily and her daughter are staying in my house for as long as they need to. That's not up for negotiation. Then we need to control the narrative. Margaret Sullivan, board member, major stockholder, professional pain in the ass, interjected. Get ahead of this. Exclusive interview, carefully staged photos, maybe a donation to a homeless charity to show your philanthropic side. No, Mason said again. Emily's not a PR opportunity. She's a person who needed help and I helped her. That's it. That's the whole story. That's not good enough, Margaret said flatly. Investors want stability. They want to know you're focused on the company, not on playing savior to every stray you find on the street. The phrase every stray hit Mason like a slap. Careful, he said quietly. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him. Or what? You'll fire us? You need us, Mason. You need our expertise, our connections, our credibility. Unless you want to run this company into the ground chasing some misguided hero complex. My hero complex built this company. And your hero complex might destroy it, Richard said. He sounded tired now, almost pleading. Mason, please, just think about what you're doing. Think about what you're risking. Mason looked around the table at these people he'd worked with for years. People he'd trusted to help him build something meaningful. People who were now asking him to choose between his company and doing the right thing. It wasn't even a choice. Meeting adjourned, Mason said, standing up. I have work to do. Mason, we're done here. He walked out, leaving chaos behind him, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. His phone was exploding with messages. His assistant, his PR team, 3 different news outlets requesting comment, but Mason ignored all of it. Instead, he called his lawyer. I need you to draft something, he said when she picked up. A trust. For Emily Carter and her daughter Lucy. Enough to keep them stable if... He stopped, the words sticking. If anything happens to me or the company. Mason, his lawyer said carefully, that's a significant financial commitment to someone you've known for 9 days. I'm aware. And you're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything. There was a long pause. Okay, I'll draft it, but Mason, be careful. This woman, whatever she is to you, she's going to be under a microscope now. Every move she makes, every word she says. Are you prepared for that? No, Mason said honestly, but we'll figure it out. He drove home in the middle of the day for the second time in a week and found Emily in the guest room packing, methodically, efficiently, the way someone did when they'd done it too many times before. What are you doing? Mason demanded from the doorway. What does it look like? Emily didn't look up from the suitcase. I'm leaving before I destroy your entire life. You're not destroying anything. The board meeting was fine. I handled it. Mason, I saw the stock price. It's down 4%. It'll recover. And if it doesn't? Emily finally looked at him, her eyes red from crying. If it keeps dropping? If your investors lose confidence and your employees lose their jobs and it's all because you were too stubborn to admit this was a mistake? It's not a mistake. How do you know? Because Mason stopped, the words catching in his throat. Because I what? Because I care about you? Because I'm falling for you? Because the thought of you leaving makes me want to burn everything down? Because why? Emily pressed. Because you make my daughter happy, Mason said instead, taking the coward's way out. Because she smiles again. Because she talks about things other than how much she misses her mother. Because for the first time in 3 years, she's acting like a kid instead of a ghost. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth, and Emily knew it. That's not enough, she said softly. It's enough for me. Emily sat down on this bed, her shoulders sagging. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be the person everyone thinks I am. The gold digger, the manipulator, You're none of those things. Then what am I? Mason crossed the room and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You're someone who's been dealt a shit hand and kept playing anyway. You're someone who loves her daughter enough to sleep in a car to keep her safe. You're someone who... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Someone I respect more than most of the people I know. Emily turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in her expression made Mason's chest ache. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too. What if this doesn't work? What if we try and it all falls apart anyway? Then at least we tried. Emily leaned against him, just for a moment, her head on his shoulder. Mason stayed perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever fragile trust this represented. "One more week," she said finally. "But if things get worse, they won't." "You don't know that." "No," Mason admitted. "I don't, but I'm willing to bet on it anyway." Emily pulled away, wiping at her eyes. "You're crazy." "Probably. Your board is going to mutiny. Let them. Your stock price is going to tank. Money's overrated anyway." Despite everything, Emily smiled. "Now I know you're crazy. Rich people don't think money's overrated." "This one does." They sat in silence for a moment, the tension slowly bleeding out of the room. Outside, Mason could hear the girls playing in Chloe's room, their laughter filtering through the walls. "I should finish unpacking," Emily said. "Yeah, you should." Neither of them moved. "Mason? Yeah? Thank you for fighting for us, even when it doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense to me." Emily stood up and started pulling clothes back out of the suitcase, and Mason watched her rebuild the small life she'd tried to pack away, and felt something shift in his chest. This was dangerous. This was stupid. This was going to end badly for everyone involved. He was doing it anyway. Because maybe Richard was right. Maybe he had forgotten everything he'd built. Maybe he was risking too much for too little return. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd finally remembered what actually mattered. The stock recovered in 3 days, which should have been the end of it. Instead, it got worse. The second wave of articles came exactly 1 week after the first, and these were different. More calculated. Someone had been digging, really digging, into Emily's past, pulling up college debt she'd defaulted on, a bankruptcy filing from 2 years ago, even traffic tickets from when she'd lived in Wisconsin. They painted a picture of someone chronically irresponsible. Someone who made bad decisions and expected other people to fix them. Someone who would absolutely use a billionaire's loneliness against him. Mason found Emily in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, sitting in the dark with her laptop open, reading through article after article with tears streaming silently down her face. "You should be asleep," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "So should you." Couldn't. Kept thinking about the meeting tomorrow with the PR team. "There's a PR team now?" Unfortunately. Mason sat down across from her. "They want to do a controlled interview, set the narrative before someone else does." "What narrative? That I'm exactly what they say I am? That you're a person who hit hard times and I chose to help. That's it." Emily finally looked at him, and the exhaustion in her face made Mason want to punch someone. "They found the bankruptcy, Mason. They found the credit card debt. They're making it sound like I'm some kind of con artist who's been planning this my whole life. Anyone who's actually read the articles can see that's bullshit. Medical debt and student loans aren't exactly master criminal territory. You'd be surprised what people believe when they want to." Emily closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "I'm ruining you. I'm watching it happen in real time and I can't stop it. You're not. Your board wants me gone. Your investors want me gone. Half the internet thinks I'm a prostitute and the other half thinks I'm a gold digger, and you're sitting here at 2 in the morning trying to figure out how to spin this instead of just admitting you made a mistake." "I didn't make a mistake." "Then what do you call this?" Emily gestured at the laptop, at the articles, at the mess they were both drowning in. "What do you call letting a stranger and her kid move in and then having your entire life dissected because of it?" "I call it the right thing to do." "Even if it costs you everything?" Mason didn't answer immediately. Couldn't answer, because the truth was he didn't know anymore. Didn't know where the line was between doing right by Emily and Lucy and protecting everything he'd built. Didn't know if there even was a line, or if it was all just one big choice that he'd already made. "My wife used to say I had a savior complex," he said instead. "She said I couldn't see someone struggling without trying to fix it, said it was going to get me in trouble someday. She was right." "Yeah." Mason rubbed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. "But she also said it was one of the things she loved about me, that I gave a shit when it would have been easier not to." Emily was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was so soft Mason almost missed it. "What was she like? Your wife?" The question caught him off guard. 3 years and he still didn't know how to talk about Sarah without feeling like he was drowning. "She was..." He stopped, searching for words that felt true instead of rehearsed. She was sharp, called me on my bullshit constantly, made me laugh even when I was being an asshole. She grew up rich, old money, the kind where your family name is on buildings, but she hated all of it. Hated the pretense and the politics and the way people treated service workers. She sounds amazing. She was. And she would have liked you, I think. Would have respected the hell out of what you're doing for Lucy. Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears. Don't do that. Do what? Make me feel like I belong in her world. In your world. It just makes this harder. Good, Mason said, and meant it. It should be hard. Walking away from something that matters should always be hard. Who said this matters? You're still here, aren't you? The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Upstairs, one of the girls cried out in her sleep. Mason thought it was Lucy, and Emily immediately stood up, already moving toward the stairs. I've got it, Mason said, catching her arm. You should try to sleep. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those articles, see what they're saying about me, about Lucy. They haven't said anything about Lucy. Not yet. But they will. They'll find some way to twist this into me being a bad mother, using my daughter to manipulate you, and then what? Emily's voice was rising, panic bleeding through. What happens when Child Services sees those articles, when they decide a woman who's been homeless and bankrupt isn't fit to raise a kid? That's not going to happen. You don't know that. You can't promise that. She was right, and they both knew it. Mason couldn't promise anything except that he'd fight like hell to keep it from happening, and sometimes fighting wasn't enough. Lucy cried out again, and Emily pulled away, heading upstairs before Mason could stop her. He followed, watching from the doorway as Emily sat on the edge of Lucy's bed, stroking her daughter's hair and murmuring soft reassurances until the little girl settled back into sleep. Mama? Lucy mumbled, not quite awake. I'm here, baby. Are we safe? Yes, we're safe. The lie came easily, automatically, the kind of lie mothers told to keep their children from being afraid. Mason watched Emily hold that lie between her teeth like it might shatter if she breathed wrong, and felt something crack in his chest. When Lucy was asleep again, Emily stood and walked past Mason without a word, heading to the guest room and closing the door with a soft click that felt louder than a slam. Mason went back to bed and didn't sleep. The PR meeting the next day was worse than he'd expected. The team, 3 polished professionals who charged more per hour than most people made in a week, had prepared a full strategy. Talking points, interview prep, even a carefully worded statement about Emily's temporary residence and Mason's charitable nature. Absolutely not, Mason said before they'd finished the first slide. The lead consultant, a woman named Patricia with severe bangs and sharper opinions, paused mid-sentence. I'm sorry? You're not positioning Emily as charity. She's not a project or a tax write-off. Mr. Hale, with all due respect, the charity angle is our best option. It positions you as philanthropic, gives you distance from any romantic implications, and explains why you'd take such an unusual step. No. Patricia exchanged glances with her colleagues. Then what would you like us to say? The truth. That I met Emily and Lucy when they needed help. That I had space and resources to offer. That it's nobody's business beyond that. That's not a narrative, Patricia said flatly. That's a headline waiting to be twisted into whatever sells papers. Then let them twist it. Mason, Richard said from across the table, his voice tight with frustration, you're not listening. We need to control this before it controls us. Or, Mason said, standing up, we could stop pretending like I owe anyone an explanation for what I do in my personal life. Your personal life affects the company. Then maybe the company needs to be less fragile. He walked out for the second time in a week, leaving behind a conference room full of people staring at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Emily was in the kitchen when he got home, teaching Lucy and Chloe how to make pasta from scratch. Flour covered every surface, both girls had it in their hair, and Emily was laughing at something Chloe had said, her hands buried in dough, looking more relaxed than Mason had seen her in days. She looked up when he entered, and the laughter died. That bad? She asked. About what I expected. Mason loosened his tie, watching Lucy carefully roll out pasta with intense concentration. They want to position you as charity. I told them no. Mason, I'm not doing it. I'm not reducing you to some kind of sob story I'm fixing out of the goodness of my heart. Maybe you should. The quiet suggestion hit harder than shouting would have. Emily, if it makes this easier, if it protects your company, I don't care about protecting the company at your expense. Well, maybe you should start caring, Emily said, her voice sharp enough that both girls looked up. She softened immediately, forcing a smile. Girls, why don't you wash up for dinner? We'll finish the pasta in a minute. Chloe opened her mouth to argue, caught sight of her father's face, and wisely decided against it. She grabbed Lucy's hand and they disappeared toward the bathroom, leaving Emily and Mason alone in the flower-covered kitchen. You can't keep doing this, Emily said as soon as they were gone. Doing what? Burning everything down to protect me. It's not sustainable and it's not fair to everyone else who depends on you. You think I don't know that? Mason's frustration finally broke through. You think I'm not aware that every decision I make affects 17,000 employees and their families? That I'm not weighing that against... He stopped, biting back words he wasn't ready to say. Against what? Emily pressed. Against two people you barely know? Two people who showed up in your life 2 weeks ago and turned everything upside down? 3 weeks, Mason corrected absently. And yes, exactly that. Emily stared at him. Why? Because watching you fight for Lucy reminds me why I started this company in the first place. Because the board meetings and stock prices and investor calls all feel meaningless compared to making sure you're safe. Because I'm falling for you and I don't know how to stop. Because it's the right thing to do, he said instead. That's not enough. It's going to have to be. Emily turned back to the pasta dough, her hands working it mechanically. The temp agency called. They have another placement starting Monday. Better pay, regular hours. I'm taking it. Okay. And I'm going to start looking for an apartment, something small, something we can afford once I have steady income. Mason's chest tightened. You don't have to... Yes, I do. I can't stay here forever, Mason. That was never the plan. Plans change. Not this one. Emily's voice was firm, but Mason could hear the waver underneath. We had a deal. 1 month, and it's been 3 weeks. 1 more week, and then we're gone. What if I don't want you to go? The question hung in the air between them, too honest, too raw. Emily went very still, her hands frozen in the dough. Don't, she said quietly. Don't what? Don't make this about what you want. Don't make me choose between keeping Lucy safe and... She stopped, took a breath. Just don't. And what about what you want? What I want doesn't matter. Bullshit. Emily spun to face him, flower flying. Okay, you want to know what I want? I want to not wake up every morning terrified that today's the day everything falls apart. I want to not see my daughter's face in articles written by people who've never met her. I want to not feel like a charity case in a house I'll never belong in. I want... Her voice cracked and she stopped, wrapping her arms around herself. I want to not be falling for someone who lives in a completely different world, she whispered. The admission knocked the air from Mason's lungs. Emily, don't. Please don't make this harder than it already is. But Mason was moving before he could think better of it, crossing the kitchen, and Emily met him halfway. They stood inches apart, close enough that he could see the flour dusting her cheek, close enough to count her heartbeats. What if I'm falling too? He asked. Then we're both idiots. Probably. Emily reached up, her flour-covered hand touching his face, and Mason stopped breathing. This can't work, she said. I know. Your board will lose their minds. I know. The tabloids will destroy us. I know. So why are you looking at me like that? Like what? Like you're about to do something really stupid. Mason smiled despite everything. Because I am. He kissed her, and Emily kissed him back, and for approximately 30 seconds, the rest of the world ceased to exist. No board meetings, no tabloids, no impossible circumstances. Just Emily's hands in his hair and his hands on her waist, and the taste of flour and coffee, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. They broke apart when they heard footsteps on the stairs, jumping away from each other like teenagers caught by parents. Chloe appeared in the doorway, took one look at them, and grinned. Finally, she announced, Lucy owes me $5. You bet on us? Emily asked, her face flushed. Lucy said it would take another week. I said 3 days. I win. We're not, this isn't... Mason fumbled for words and found none. Sure, Chloe said, utterly unconvinced. Can we finish the pasta now? I'm starving and you guys are being weird. They finished the pasta in awkward silence, both of them hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every glance. The girls chattered away, oblivious to the tension, and Mason found himself watching Emily's hands as she worked, remembering how they'd felt in his hair. This was a mistake, a huge, catastrophic mistake that would make everything infinitely more complicated. He couldn't bring himself to regret it. Dinner was chaotic. The pasta was slightly undercooked and the sauce too salty, and Chloe spilled an entire glass of water across the table. But it was the best meal Mason had eaten in years. Emily kept catching his eye and looking away, a small smile playing at her lips, and every time it happened, Mason felt something in his chest expand. After dinner, after the girls were in bed, after the kitchen was cleaned and the house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Mason found Emily on the back deck overlooking the lake. She'd wrapped herself in one of his old sweatshirts, the sleeves hanging past her hands, and stood at the railing watching moonlight on the water. "You shouldn't have done that," she said without turning around. "The kiss? All of it. The meeting, the PR team, She gestured vaguely. "The everything." Mason joined her in the railing, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Probably not. This is going to get messy. It's already messy. Messier then." "I can handle messy." Emily turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in her expression made Mason's chest ache. "What if I can't? What if I mess this up the way I've messed up everything else?" "You haven't messed up everything else." "Mason, I was sleeping in a car 3 weeks ago. I'd call that a pretty significant mess-up. You were surviving. There's a difference." "Is there?" Emily's voice was small, uncertain in a way that made Mason want to fight everyone who'd ever made her feel less than extraordinary. "Yeah," he said firmly. "There is. And Emily—" He caught her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Whatever happens next, whatever mess we're walking into, I want you to know I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you and Lucy. Not out of pity or charity or some savior complex, because I want to." "Why?" "Because you make me remember what it feels like to give a shit about something other than quarterly earnings. Because my daughter smiles again. Because—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm drowning anymore." Emily's eyes were bright with tears. "That's a lot of pressure to put on someone who can barely keep her own life together." "Then maybe we can barely keep our lives together as a team." Despite the tears, Emily laughed. "That's the worst pitch I've ever heard." "Yeah, well, I'm new at this. Cut me some slack." She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and they stood like that for a long moment while the lake whispered against the shore below. "One more week," Emily said finally. "That's all I'm promising. One more week, and then we reassess." It wasn't what Mason wanted. He wanted forever, wanted certainty, wanted promises neither of them could make. But it was better than nothing. "One more week," he agreed. They stayed on the deck until the cold drove them inside, and when they parted at the guest room door, Emily stood on her toes and kissed him again. Soft, brief, terrifying in its tenderness. "Good night, Mason." "Good night." He went to bed and lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell he was doing. Wondering if this was brave or stupid or some combination of both. Wondering if loving Emily Carter was going to save him or destroy everything he'd spent 15 years building. The next morning brought answers he wasn't expecting. Mason was in his home office, trying to focus on a contract review and failing miserably, when his assistant called. "You need to turn on Channel 7, she said without preamble. "Why?" "Just do it." Mason grabbed the remote and flipped to the local news. The anchor was mid-sentence, and it took him a moment to process what he was seeing. Margaret Sullivan, board member, major investor, perpetual thorn in Mason's side. Sitting in a studio being interviewed about Hale Logistics and its troubled CEO. "Question of judgment," Margaret was saying, her expression grave. "We all have sympathy for Mr. Hale's personal struggles, but when those struggles begin to affect the company's performance and reputation, the board has a responsibility to act." "And what form would that action take?" the anchor asked. "We're exploring all options, including a vote of no confidence if Mr. Hale continues to prioritize his personal life over his fiduciary duties." Mason's phone started ringing before the interview finished. Richard, his lawyer, 2 other board members, all of them talking at once about damage control and emergency meetings and how they'd warned him this would happen. He ignored all of them. Instead, he went upstairs and found Emily in the guest room, packing again. "You saw," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. I'm leaving, right now, before this gets any worse." "No." "Mason, they're talking about removing you from your own company. Let them try." Mason crossed the room and grabbed her hand, stopping her frantic packing. "Emily, listen to me. I don't care what Margaret Sullivan says on TV. I don't care what the board thinks. I care about you and Lucy, and I'm not letting you leave because some vultures smell blood. This isn't about vultures. This is about reality. About the fact that I'm destroying everything you've built and you're too stubborn to see it. What I see," Mason said carefully, "is a woman who's been told her whole life that she doesn't deserve good things, that she's not worth fighting for. And I'm telling you, that's bullshit." Emily's face crumpled. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone worth all this chaos." "You already are. You just have to believe it." There was a knock on the door frame. Chloe stood there, Lucy beside her, both girls looking smaller than usual. "Are you leaving?" Chloe asked Emily, her voice wavering. Emily looked at Mason, at the girls, at the impossible situation she'd walked into 3 weeks ago. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Please don't," Lucy whispered. "I like it here. I like having a room and eating dinner together and—" She started crying, and Emily dropped to her knees, pulling Lucy into her arms. "Oh, baby, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "It's okay if we have to go back to the car," Lucy said through her tears. "I know you're trying, but I don't want to leave Chloe. She's my best friend." Mason watched Chloe wrap her arms around both of them, this tangle of girls and tears and love that had somehow formed in 3 weeks, and made a decision. "Nobody's leaving," he said. Emily looked up at him. "Mason, nobody's leaving," he repeated. "I don't care what the board does. I don't care if they try to vote me out. You and Lucy stay. That's not negotiable. You can't just watch me." The doorbell rang, loud and unexpected. Mason went downstairs to find a process server with legal papers. Notice of an emergency board meeting scheduled for the following Monday. A meeting to discuss his fitness to lead. He signed for the papers, closed the door, and started laughing. "What's funny?" Emily had followed him downstairs, worry written across her face. "They're actually going to try it. They're actually going to try to take the company away from me." "And you're laughing?" "Yeah." Mason set the papers on the hall table. "Because I just realized something. I spent 15 years building Hale Logistics. 15 years working 80-hour weeks and missing everything that mattered because I thought success meant having the biggest company and the highest stock price." "Mason, but you know what? The 3 weeks you've been here have been better than the last 3 years combined. So if they want to take the company, let them. I'll build something else, something better." "You don't mean that." "I absolutely mean that." Emily stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're going to give up everything you've built for what? For us? If that's what it takes? That's insane." "Probably," Mason agreed, "but I'm doing it anyway." Emily opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Finally, she just shook her head and kissed him, hard and desperate and real. "You're an idiot," she said against his lips. "I've been told, and I'm terrified. Me too. But I'm staying, 1 more week at least. We'll figure out the rest as we go." It wasn't a promise of forever, wasn't even a promise of next month. But it was enough. Mason pulled her closer and held on, and tried not to think about the battle coming Monday. Tried not to calculate the odds or plan his strategy or do any of the things that usually kept him 3 steps ahead. For the first time in 15 years, he just let himself feel, and hoped like hell it would be enough. The weekend before the board meeting, Mason did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He turned off his phone. Not silenced. Not forwarded to his assistant. Actually powered down and stuck in a drawer while Emily watched with an expression somewhere between admiration and horror. "You're really doing this," she said. "I'm really doing this. Your lawyer is going to have a heart attack. She'll survive." Mason closed the drawer with finality. "I need 2 days to think without everyone telling me what I should be thinking." Emily leaned against the kitchen counter, studying him. "And what are you thinking?" "That I've been playing their game for 15 years and I'm tired of it." Mason poured himself coffee, his hands steadier than they'd been in weeks. That maybe Margaret Sullivan is right, and I don't belong in that boardroom anymore. Mason, not because I'm unfit, because I don't want to be the kind of person who chooses stock prices over people anymore. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Emily crossed the kitchen and took his hand. What are you going to do Monday? I have no idea, but I have 48 hours to figure it out. They spent Saturday pretending the world outside didn't exist. Mason taught the girls how to skip stones on the lake. Lucy's technique was terrible, but her enthusiasm made up for it. Emily made lasagna from scratch, destroying the kitchen again in the process, and nobody cared. They watched movies curled up on the couch, the four of them tangled together like they'd been doing this for years instead of weeks. Sunday morning brought snow, the first real snow of the season, and Chloe's shriek of excitement woke the entire house at 6 a.m. "Daddy! Lucy! It's snowing!" Mason stumbled downstairs to find both girls already dressed in mismatched winter gear, bouncing with impatience. Emily appeared behind him, her hair a mess, wearing his sweatshirt again. "They've been up for an hour," she said, yawning. "I tried to get them to wait, but—" "Can we build a snowman?" Chloe interrupted. "Please, please, please?" Lucy nodded vigorously, already pulling on boots that were too big for her. Mason looked at Emily. Emily shrugged. 20 minutes later, they were all outside, the lake pewter gray beyond the falling snow, building what would generously be called a snowman and more accurately described as a lumpy disaster. "It needs a face," Chloe declared, already scouting for rocks. "And a scarf," Lucy added. Mason found himself shoulder to shoulder with Emily, packing snow while the girls ransacked the garage for accessories. The cold bit at his fingers, but he barely noticed. "I can't remember the last time I did this," he said. "Built a snowman?" "Just existed, without checking my phone every 5 minutes, without thinking about the next meeting or the next quarter or the next—" He stopped. "I forgot what it felt like." Emily bumped her shoulder against his. "How does it feel?" "Terrifying, amazing, both at the same time." "Yeah," Emily said softly. "I know what you mean." They worked in comfortable silence until the girls returned with an alarming collection of items, including a traffic cone, 3 scarves, and what appeared to be a garden gnome. "Where did you find a traffic cone?" Mason asked. "The garage," Chloe said, like this was obvious. "Can we use it as a hat?" The snowman ended up wearing the traffic cone, the garden gnome, and all 3 scarves in a configuration that defied both physics and good taste. It was perfect. Lucy stood back, admiring their work, and said something that made Mason's chest tight. "I wish we could stay here forever." The silence that followed was heavy. Chloe grabbed Lucy's hand. "You can stay," she said fiercely. "Right, Daddy? They can stay forever?" Mason looked at Emily, at the fear and hope warring in her expression, and knew they couldn't avoid this conversation anymore. "Let's go inside," he said. "I think we need to talk." They sent the girls upstairs to change into dry clothes, a task that would take approximately forever given their tendency to get distracted, and settled in the living room. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tight, and Mason recognized the posture. She was preparing to run. "Before you say anything," Emily started, "I've been looking at apartments. There's one in Oak Park, close to the temp agency. It's small, but Lucy and I could— Marry me." Emily's mouth fell open. "What?" Mason hadn't planned it, hadn't even thought about it until the words were out. But now that they were, he realized he'd never been more certain of anything. "Marry me," he said again. "Move in permanently. Stop looking at apartments and temp jobs and exit strategies. Just stay." "Mason, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. You're about to lose your company. Your board is trying to remove you. The tabloids are destroying both of us. And your solution is marriage?" "My solution," Mason said carefully, "is building a life with someone who makes me want to build a life again. Everything else is just noise." Emily stood up, pacing. "This is insane. We've known each other for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Mason. People don't get married after 3 weeks. People don't take in homeless strangers either, but here we are. That's different. How? Because marriage it's permanent. It's legal. Emily's voice cracked. "It's setting yourself up for disaster when you could just walk away now with minimal damage. I don't want minimal damage. I want you. You want the idea of me, Emily said, still pacing. You want the fantasy of fixing the broken woman and her daughter, but that's not real, Mason. Real is messy and disappointing, and I know what real is, Mason interrupted. Real is watching you cry over tabloid articles at 2 a.m. Real is the way you steal the last piece of bacon and pretend you didn't. Real is how Lucy still wakes up, sometimes thinking she's in the car, and you have to remind her she's safe. Emily had stopped pacing, tears streaming down her face. Real, Mason continued, is me being terrified that you're going to leave and take the only good thing that's happened to me in 3 years. So yeah, I'm asking you to marry me after 3 weeks. And yeah, it's crazy, but I'm doing it anyway. I can't, Emily's voice broke. I can't give you what you're looking for. I'm not put together enough to be someone's wife, someone's stepmother. I'm barely holding my own life together. You think I'm put together? Mason laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Emily, I've spent 3 years pretending to be functional while dying inside. You're the first person who's made me want to actually live instead of just survive. That's too much pressure. Then share it with me. Let me carry some of yours and you carry some of mine, and we figure it out together. Emily was shaking her head, but Mason could see the want in her expression, the desperate desire to believe this could actually work. What about Monday? She asked. What about the board meeting? I'll handle it. How? I don't know yet, but I will. Emily sat back down, her legs seeming to give out. You're really serious about this. Dead serious. We'd be terrible at it, at being married. We'd fight and screw up and probably, Mason agreed, but we'd do it together. The silence stretched out. Upstairs they could hear the girls laughing about something, their voices bright with the uncomplicated joy of children who didn't understand that the adults were trying to figure out impossible things. I need time, Emily said finally. I need to think about what this means for Lucy, for me. I can't make this decision based on feelings. Okay. Take all the time you need. I'll still be here when you're ready. Emily looked at him like he'd offered her something precious and terrifying at the same time. You're going to regret this. I really don't think I will. She left the room without answering, and Mason sat alone wondering if he'd just made the best or worst decision of his life. Monday morning arrived with crystal clear skies and temperatures cold enough to hurt. Mason put his phone back together. 147 missed calls, 89 emails marked urgent, and drove to the office knowing this might be the last time he made this trip as CEO. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. Mason arrived at 9:30 to find the parking lot full of news vans and reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the situation. He pushed through them without comment, ignoring the shouted questions about Emily and the company and whether he was planning to resign. Inside, Richard was waiting in Mason's office, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Please tell me you have a plan, Richard said. I have a plan. Care to share it with the rest of us? Not really, Richard groaned. Mason, they have the votes. Margaret's been working the phones all weekend. Unless you're planning to pull off a miracle, you're done. Then I guess I'd better pull off a miracle. The boardroom was packed. All 12 board members, plus lawyers, plus several major investors who'd requested to attend. Margaret sat at the far end of the table, looking smug and polished, her presentation already loaded and ready to go. Mason took a seat at the head of the table and waited. Margaret didn't waste time. Her presentation was brutal and efficient. Stock price fluctuations, employee morale surveys showing concern about leadership, a detailed timeline of Mason's erratic behavior over the past 3 weeks. She even had quotes from unnamed executives expressing concern about his judgment. The question before this board, Margaret concluded, is simple. Can we trust Mason Hale to lead this company, or has his personal crisis compromised his ability to make sound decisions? I have a question, Mason said into the silence that followed. Margaret looked annoyed at the interruption. Of course. When I started this company 15 years ago, what was the mission statement? I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me. Margaret consulted her notes. To provide logistics solutions that prioritize efficiency and reliability. Wrong, Mason said. The original mission statement was to build a company that proves you can be successful without being soulless. Confused glances around the table. Mason stood up, suddenly unable to sit still. I grew up poor, he said, sleeping in shelters, eating donated food, wearing clothes from charity bins. When I built Hale Logistics, I swore I'd do it differently. I'd treat employees like human beings. I'd prioritize ethics over profit. I'd prove you could build an empire without losing your humanity. That's very touching, Margaret said, but it doesn't change the fact that your recent behavior— My recent behavior, Mason interrupted, has been helping a woman and her child who were homeless. Just like I was once homeless. Just like 17,000 of our employees could become homeless if they lost their jobs. And you want to remove me because that's bad optics? We want to remove you because you're distracted. I'm focused. For the first time in 3 years, I'm actually focused on what matters. Mason looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. You're right that I've changed. I have. Because I spent 3 years going through the motions while my daughter grew up without a parent who was actually present, while I built profits on the backs of people I barely noticed, while I became exactly the kind of soulless executive I swore I'd never be. Richard was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. Margaret's expression had gone from smug to uncertain. Emily Carter didn't manipulate me, Mason continued. She reminded me why I started this company. She reminded me that people matter more than stock prices. And if choosing to help her means I lose your confidence, then maybe I don't want your confidence anymore. Mason, Richard started, I'm not finished. Mason pulled out the papers he'd had his lawyer prepare over the weekend. I'm offering to buy out any board member who wants to leave. Fair market value plus 20%, no strings attached. Anyone who doesn't want to be part of a company that prioritizes humanity over quarterly earnings can take the money and go. Silence. Margaret looked at the papers like they might bite her. You can't afford to buy us all out, she said. Watch me. I own 60% of voting shares. I have the capital. And I'm willing to leverage everything I have to prove a point. What point? Margaret demanded. That I'd rather run a smaller company with people who share my values than a massive company full of people who think helping a homeless woman is a liability. The room erupted, arguments breaking out across the table, lawyers conferring in rapid whispers, Richard looking like he might actually have that heart attack his doctor kept warning him about. Mason let it go on for exactly 2 minutes, then held up his hand. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. We're going to vote, right now. No confidence in my leadership, yes or no. Anyone who votes yes can take my buyout offer. Anyone who votes no stays on with the understanding that this company's mission is changing. We're pivoting to prioritize worker welfare, ethical practices, and long-term sustainability over short-term profits. That's commercial suicide, Margaret said flatly. Maybe. Or maybe it's the future of business. I guess we'll find out. The vote took 15 minutes. When it was done, 5 board members, including Margaret, had voted no confidence. 7 had voted to keep Mason as CEO. Margaret stood up, gathering her things with sharp, angry movements. You'll regret this. I really don't think I will, Mason said, echoing his words to Emily. Margaret and the 4 other dissenting board members left, and Mason was left with 7 people who looked shell-shocked but intrigued. So, Richard said finally, what now? Now, Mason said, we figure out how to actually change things, and we start by raising the minimum wage for all entry-level positions by 40%. That's going to cost— I know what it's going to cost. Do it anyway. Mason left the office at 2 p.m., earlier than he'd left in years, and drove home with his hands shaking on the wheel. He just bet everything on a vision that might tank the company, might prove Margaret right, might destroy everything he'd built. He'd also never felt more certain he'd done the right thing. Emily was in the kitchen when he got home, teaching Lucy how to measure ingredients while Chloe provided running commentary. She looked up when he entered, her expression anxious. How did it go? I might have just destroyed my company, Mason said, or saved it. Hard to tell which. Emily set down the measuring cup. What happened? Mason told her everything, the vote, the buyout offer, the complete restructuring of the company's priorities. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to something that looked almost like pride. You're insane, she said when he finished. I've been told. And you did all that because you were right. Because I had forgotten what actually mattered. Because— Mason glanced at the girls who were pretending not to listen, while absolutely listening. Because I'd rather be poor and happy than rich and empty. Emily's eyes filled with tears. You're not going to be poor. You don't know that. Yeah, I do, because I've been poor my whole life, and I recognize the difference between someone who's broke and someone who's just temporarily less rich. She smiled through the tears. You'll figure it out. We'll figure it out, Mason corrected. Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she turned to the girls. Can you two go upstairs for a few minutes? Grown-ups need to talk about boring adult stuff. Is it about you guys getting married? Chloe asked. Mason choked on air. How did you... I heard you yesterday. You're not as quiet as you think you are. Chloe grabbed Lucy's hand. Come on. If they say yes, we'll make them a cake. What if they say no? Lucy asked. Then we'll make them a cake to cheer them up. Either way, cake. The girls thundered upstairs, leaving Mason and Emily alone in the flour-dusted kitchen. So, Emily said, marriage. You don't have to answer now. Yes. Mason's brain stalled. Yes? Yes. I'll marry you. Not because you saved me, or because you're rich, or because my other options are terrible, but because... Emily's voice wavered. Because you're the first person who's ever made me feel like I'm worth fighting for. Emily, I'm going to be terrible at this, she continued. I'm going to mess up and doubt everything and probably try to run away at least 3 more times before we actually make it to a wedding. But I want to try. Mason crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Emily held on tight, her face buried against his chest, and Mason felt something in him settle, something that had been restless and aching for 3 years. We're both going to mess this up, he said against her hair. Probably. And it's going to be hard. Definitely. But we're doing it anyway. Yeah. Emily pulled back to look at him, and she was smiling through tears. We're doing it anyway. They kissed, and this time it felt different. Not desperate or stolen or weighted with uncertainty. Just right. Upstairs, they heard Chloe's shriek of triumph, followed by Lucy's delighted laughter. Apparently the spying had been mutual. They're making us a cake, Emily said. Should we be worried? Absolutely, but I'm too happy to care. The wedding happened 3 months later in the same roadside diner where they'd met. It was Emily's idea. She'd insisted on it despite Mason's offers of fancy venues and expensive coordinators. Just them, the girls, Richard and his wife, Mrs. Chen, and Deb the waitress who'd served them that first night. The diner owner closed for the afternoon, gave them the same booth by the window, and Emily wore a simple dress she'd bought off the rack. Mason wore jeans and a button-down. Lucy and Chloe wore matching flower girl dresses and argued cheerfully about who got to hold the rings. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes. The celebration lasted 4 hours, ending only when Deb insisted they had to reopen for the dinner rush. Best wedding I've ever worked, she said, pocketing the obscene tip Mason left. Come back any time. They drove home as a family, officially now, legally, and found a small crowd of reporters still camped outside the gates. Mason was about to call security when Emily stopped him. Let me, she said. She rolled down the window and the reporters surged forward shouting questions. Emily waited until they quieted down. I know what you all think, she said. You think I'm a gold digger. You think I manipulated a grieving widower. You think I'm using my daughter to secure a meal ticket. She paused. And honestly, I don't care anymore. Because I know the truth. I know that Mason sees me as a person, not a charity case. I know that my daughter is safe and loved. And I know that sometimes the best things in life happen when you stop worrying about what everyone else thinks and just choose to be happy. She rolled up the window before they could respond, and Mason pulled through the gates. That was either very brave or very stupid, he said. Probably both, Emily agreed. I'm getting good at that. The restructuring of Hale Logistics took the better part of a year. The stock price dropped initially, just like Margaret predicted. Several major investors pulled out. The business media wrote think pieces about Mason's noble but doomed experiment. Then something unexpected happened. Employee retention shot up. Productivity increased. Smaller clients who'd been priced out by competitors started choosing Hale specifically because of their ethical practices. A viral video about their worker benefits program brought in a wave of new business from companies trying to improve their own public image. The stock price recovered, then exceeded its previous high, then kept climbing. Richard called Mason on a Tuesday afternoon, 18 months after the board meeting, sounding bemused. We're being written up in the Harvard Business Review, he said, as a case study in sustainable capitalism. Is that good? That's very good. It means you were right and I was wrong, and I'm never going to hear the end of it. Probably not, Mason agreed, grinning. Emily started a nonprofit, funded initially by Mason, but increasingly supported by donations from people who'd read her story and wanted to help. The organization focused on preventing homelessness before it happened, providing emergency funds and support systems for single parents on the edge. Within 2 years, they'd helped over 3,000 families. Emily ran it from a small office downtown, refusing to take a salary until Mason pointed out that martyrdom wasn't actually a sustainable business model. Besides, he'd said, we're married now. Your money is my money, and vice versa. Stop being stubborn and pay yourself. I hate when you're logical, Emily had muttered, but she'd started taking the salary. Lucy thrived. Started kindergarten, made friends, stopped waking up scared. She and Chloe were genuinely sisters now, fought like sisters, loved like sisters, conspired like sisters. Mason found them one afternoon trying to figure out how to convince him to get a dog. We've prepared a presentation, Chloe announced seriously. Of course you have, Mason said. The presentation involved a slideshow, props, and a disturbing amount of research into dog breeds. Mason lasted approximately 6 minutes before caving. They got a rescue mutt named Pancake, who was terrified of everything except the girls. It was perfect. 2 years after the wedding, Emily woke up in the middle of the night and found Mason standing at the bedroom window, looking out at the lake. Can't sleep? She asked. Just thinking. About what? Mason turned to face her, and in the dim light from the hallway she could see he'd been crying. Hey, she said, immediately alert. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Mason's voice was rough. I was just thinking about that night at the diner, about how close I came to not stopping, to just driving past and pretending I didn't see you. Emily got out of bed and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. But you didn't. But I almost did. I almost decided it wasn't my problem, almost convinced myself that getting involved would be too complicated. And instead I got everything I didn't know I needed. Mason held her tighter. I got you, I got Lucy, I got my daughter back. I got to remember that money's worthless if you're spending it alone. Emily pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her cheek. I love you. You know that? I know. I love you too. Even though I burned dinner tonight, especially because you burned dinner tonight. They stood like that for a long moment, looking out at the lake, at the life they'd built from broken pieces and impossible odds. Do you ever regret it? Emily asked quietly. Any of it? Not even once. Not even when I tried to leave that 5th time? Mason laughed. Okay, maybe that time, but only briefly. Emily smiled against his chest. What about when the stock tanked? Nope. When Margaret Sullivan went on TV calling you delusional? That was actually fun to watch. She was so angry. You're enjoying this too much. I'm enjoying you too much. Emily pulled back to look at him. That was terrible. I know, I'm out of practice with the romantic stuff. You literally planned a surprise trip to Paris last month. You're not out of practice. Then I'm intentionally being terrible. That tracks. They went back to bed, tangled together the way they'd learned to sleep, and Emily lay awake for a while listening to Mason's breathing, even out into sleep. She thought about the car they'd lived in, about the temp jobs and rejection letters, and nights of wondering if tomorrow would be the day everything finally fell apart. She thought about Lucy asleep down the hall, in a room full of books and toys and security. About Chloe in the next room, probably still awake reading under the covers. About Pancake sprawled across both their beds because the dog had never learned about personal space. She thought about the nonprofit and the families they'd helped, and the emails she got sometimes from single mothers thanking her for proving it was possible to survive. And she thought about Mason, who'd seen her at her absolute worst and chosen to love her anyway. Emily wasn't naive enough to think everything was perfect now. She still had bad days, still woke up sometimes convinced this was all temporary, still got angry at tabloid articles, fewer now, but they still came, painting her as something she wasn't. But she'd learned that perfect wasn't the goal. Surviving was the goal. Building something real was the goal. Choosing to keep trying even when it would be easier to quit was the goal. And by those metrics, she was doing okay. 3 years after the wedding, they took the girls back to the diner for dinner. Just a regular Tuesday evening, nothing special, except it was everything. They sat in the same booth. Chloe ordered chicken tenders. Lucy wanted a burger. Emily got the pasta that she knew wouldn't be as good as homemade, but ordered anyway because it felt right. Mason ordered fries and coffee and watched his family with an expression that made Emily's chest tight. "What?" she asked. "Just remembering?" "The first night? Yeah, you were so scared, so determined not to take help." "I was an idiot." "You were brave." "Same thing sometimes." Deb came over to refill their coffee, older now but still working doubles, still treating regulars like family. "How's the nonprofit going?" she asked Emily. "Good, really good. We're expanding to 3 more cities next quarter." "That's wonderful. I tell people about you all the time, about how you and Mr. Hale met right here in this booth." Emily smiled. "We've gotten a lot of mileage out of that story." "It's a good story, gives people hope." After Deb left, Lucy looked up from her burger. "Mama, tell us the story again." "You've heard it 1,000,000 times, sweetheart." "I want to hear it again." So Emily told it again, the story of a rainy night and desperation and a man who'd chosen to see past all the reasons to keep driving. She told it the way she always did, honest about the fear and the shame and the impossibility of it all. And when she finished, Lucy and Chloe were grinning like they'd never heard it before, and Mason was looking at her like she'd hung the moon. "I'm glad you stopped," Lucy said seriously. "Me too, sweetheart. Even though Daddy was a stranger, and you didn't know if he was safe. Even though? That was brave. Or stupid," Emily said, echoing the old joke. "Same thing sometimes," Chloe repeated, and everyone laughed. They drove home through streets that had become familiar, past houses that had stopped looking intimidating, through gates that now felt like coming home instead of trespassing. Inside, Pancake went berserk the way he always did, jumping and spinning and generally losing his mind with joy. The girls took him out to the yard while Mason and Emily stood in the foyer that had once felt like a museum and now just felt like theirs. "Thank you," Emily said suddenly. "For what? For being crazy enough to stop at that diner? For being stubborn enough to keep fighting for us? For—" She gestured around. "For all of this." Mason pulled her close. "Thank you for being brave enough to accept help, and stubborn enough to stay when it got hard. We're both pretty stubborn. That's probably why this works." They kissed, and upstairs Chloe yelled something about Pancake eating a shoe, and Lucy was laughing, and the house was full of chaos and noise and life. It wasn't perfect. Would never be perfect. They still fought sometimes about stupid things, still had days where the past felt heavier than the present, still struggled with Emily's instinct to run and Mason's instinct to fix everything with money. But they'd learned that perfect wasn't the point. The point was showing up, choosing each other, building something real from broken pieces. The point was remembering that sometimes the greatest fortune in life came from noticing the people everyone else ignored, from choosing courage over comfort, from believing that broken things could be mended if you were willing to do the work. And as Emily stood in the foyer of a house that had once felt impossible, surrounded by the family she'd never thought she'd have, she realized something important. She'd spent her whole life being invisible, being overlooked, being told through 1,000 small actions that she didn't matter. But she did matter. Lucy mattered. Everyone struggling in cars and shelters and impossible situations mattered. And maybe that was the real story. Not the billionaire who saved the homeless woman, not the rags to riches fairy tale that tabloids loved to sell, but the simple revolutionary idea that every person deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be given a chance when they'd run out of chances. That night, after the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, Mason found Emily at her laptop working on grant proposals for the nonprofit. "You should sleep," he said. "Just finishing this one application, housing initiative for single mothers in Detroit." Mason read over her shoulder, watching her passionate argument for why everyone deserves stability and safety regardless of their circumstances. "You're going to change the world," he said. Emily laughed. "I'm just trying to help a few people." "That's how you change the world, a few people at a time." She saved the document and closed the laptop, letting Mason pull her to her feet. "Come on," he said. "Let's go to bed before you decide to save another city tonight." They walked upstairs together, past Lucy's room where a nightlight cast soft shadows, past Chloe's room where she was definitely still awake reading, past all the evidence of a life they'd built together. And as Emily climbed into bed next to the man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to stay, she thought about that rainy night 3 years ago, about how close she'd come to walking away from the diner, how close she'd come to never accepting help, how close she'd come to missing all of this. "Hey, Mason," she said into the darkness. "Yeah? I'm glad you were crazy enough to offer us dinner. I'm glad you were brave enough to accept. Same thing sometimes," Emily said, and fell asleep smiling, knowing that tomorrow they'd wake up and do it all again. The chaos and the love and the messy, imperfect, beautiful work of building a life together. Because that's what mattered in the end. Not the money or the mansion or the fairy tale ending, just the choice to see each other, to fight for each other, to believe that broken people could build something whole if they were willing to try. And they were willing. Every single day they were willing. That was enough. That was everything.